What does it take for a nation to trade its freedom for a promise? For Germany after World War I, the answer was despair. The year was 1918. The guns of the Great War had finally fallen silent, but peace brought little comfort to Germany. The once proud empire lay in ruins, economically shattered, politically humiliated, and spiritually broken. The Treaty of Versailles was not just a document. For millions of Germans, it was a dagger to the heart. It blamed Germany for the war, forced massive reparations, and disarmed the nation. Territories were stripped away, national pride evaporated, and in its place, anger, shame, and a hunger for redemption. Inflation spiraled out of control. In 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Middle-class families saw their savings vanish overnight. Children starved. Veterans returned from the trenches only to face unemployment and national humiliation. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg were filled not just with beggars, but with rage. Amid the chaos, the Weimar Republic was born. It was meant to be a democracy, modern, progressive, and free. But it was fragile, riddled with political infighting and extremist threats on both the left and right. Every election seemed to bring more instability. Every new chancellor was weaker than the last. The people didn't trust the government, they despised it. And while the politicians argued, armed militias roamed the streets. Communist uprisings clashed with nationalist paramilitaries. In this lawless void, a new force emerged, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. Formed in 1921, this group acted as the muscle behind a small but fiery political party, the National Socialists, or Nazis. The SA was violent, unruly, and aggressive, but to many Germans, they were a symbol of order amid the collapse. They marched when others begged, they fought when others hid, and leading them, inspiring them, was a man who seemed to understand the pain of a wounded nation. Adolf Hitler, a failed artist, a wounded soldier, a man consumed by hatred, ambition, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. He spoke in thunderous tones, promising revival. What happens when the monster you created grows larger than you? Do you try to tame it or destroy it? By 1933, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his popularity. The German people, battered by depression and desperate for stability, had handed him unprecedented power. But as the world looked on, some with hope, others with dread, a storm was building within the very heart of Hitler's own movement. At the center of that storm was a man named Ernst Röhm. A longtime ally, Röhm had marched beside Hitler during the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. He was not just a follower, he was a comrade in arms, a fellow revolutionary. While Hitler inspired the masses with his speeches, Röhm commanded loyalty through raw power, and his power came from the streets. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, had started as a ragtag group of thugs and ex-soldiers, bodyguards for Nazi rallies, brawlers in political fights. But under Röhm's command, they evolved into something much more formidable, a militia of over 4 million men. They wore brown shirts, marched in massive formations, and called Röhm their chief. To Röhm, the SA was not just a security force, it was the instrument of a true revolution. He envisioned a new Germany run not by aristocrats or generals, but by the soldiers of the streets. He wanted the SA to replace the traditional army, to become the foundation of the Nazi military machine. He dreamed of tearing down the old order completely, including the military elite, the conservative establishment, and even the very institutions that had reluctantly accepted Hitler. But that vision was not Hitler's. Now in power, Hitler no longer needed street brawls and revolutionary chaos. He needed stability. He needed the support of the Reichswehr, the official German army. He needed the loyalty of industrialists, financiers, and conservative leaders. And for them, the SA was a nightmare. SA members were undisciplined, radical, and dangerously unpredictable. They attacked civilians, stormed businesses, and humiliated officials. Röhm, with his growing arrogance, began referring to Hitler's cabinet as reactionary trash. Some in the SA even whispered that Hitler had lost his nerve, that the revolution had been betrayed. Alarm bells rang within Germany's power structure. Top military commanders issued warnings. If the SA is not reined in, we will act. President Hindenburg, frail and old but still a respected symbol, sent word through his advisors. Hitler must choose between the army and Röhm. And in the shadows, another force was preparing. The SS, once a mere protective unit within the SA, had grown under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. Unlike the SA, the SS valued order, loyalty, and obedience. They wore black, moved quietly, and watched everything, and their eyes were on Röhm. Behind closed doors, Himmler and Heydrich began collecting dossiers, gathering testimonies, and preparing a plan. They spoke not of revolution, but of cleansing, a silent, efficient strike that would eliminate the chaos threatening Hitler's control. Even Hermann Göring, head of the Prussian police and one of Hitler's oldest allies, began to align himself with the SS. Ambitions swirled through every corner of the Nazi hierarchy. The tension was no longer between Nazis and their enemies, but among Nazis themselves. Hitler stood at a crossroads. Röhm was more than a general. He was a symbol, a brother in arms. But now, his very presence threatened the delicate balance Hitler had constructed. The army demanded his removal, the conservatives demanded control, and the SS simply waited for the order. Power is never permanent, especially when those who helped you rise begin to believe they deserve your throne. By early 1934, the storm within Nazi Germany was no longer silent. What had begun as whispers in dark corridors was now being shouted across military barracks, political offices, and even the streets. The SA had become a threat too large to ignore. At the center of this rising conflict was Ernst Röhm, whose ambitions had now crossed a dangerous line. Röhm demanded what many saw as unthinkable, to merge the official German army, the Reichswehr, with the SA, placing himself at the head of a new, revolutionary military force. With over 4 million stormtroopers at his command, Röhm no longer whispered about reform. He openly called for a second revolution, one that would overthrow the conservative elites who, in his view, had hijacked the Nazi dream. To the generals of the Reichswehr, this was nothing short of treason. These were career military men, deeply traditional, loyal to the old order, and already uneasy about Hitler's rise. Röhm's plan was an open threat to their very existence, and so they gave Hitler an ultimatum: disband the SA or face a military coup. Hitler found himself in an impossible bind. On one side was Röhm, the comrade who had helped build the Nazi movement from the ground up. On the other were the generals, the last institution capable of checking Hitler's power and the key to legitimizing his rule. As the pressure mounted, an unexpected voice entered the fray. Franz von Papen, Vice-Chancellor of Germany and a respected conservative. On June 17, 1934, at the University of Marburg, von Papen delivered what would become known as the Marburg Speech. It was not a direct attack, but its meaning was unmistakable. Von Papen warned against excesses of the revolution, condemned lawless violence, and called for a return to order and civil liberties. Though carefully worded, it was a public challenge to Hitler's authority and a direct warning about the dangers of the SA.
This can't be good.
The speech was supposed to be
Censored, but it was published, and it sent a clear signal to all of Germany's political class. Hitler was losing control. Meanwhile, President Paul von Hindenburg, Germany's aging and revered head of state, lay gravely ill. But even on his deathbed, he made his position clear. The SA must be dealt with now. His advisors delivered the message to Hitler: either reign in Rome and the SA, or Hindenburg would declare martial law and transfer control of the government to the army. For Hitler, the stakes could not be higher. If he defied the army, he risked a coup. If he turned against Rome, he would be betraying one of his closest allies and alienating the radicals who had helped bring him to power. But for a man like Hitler, who valued power above all else, the choice was becoming clear. Behind the scenes, he met in secret with the army's top commanders. In exchange for their support, he promised to preserve the army's independence and eliminate the threat posed by Rome. It would not be a mere political maneuver. It would be a purge, a reckoning, a message. The plan was already taking shape.
The operation begins now.
In the silence of night, they came, not with warnings, but with names, orders, and loaded guns. June 30th, 1934. The sun had barely risen over Germany when the knives were drawn, though none of them were seen in daylight. In the early morning hours, Adolf Hitler himself led a convoy of armed SS and police officers to a small hotel in Bad Wiessee, where Ernst Röhm and other top SA leaders were staying. The scene was quiet, too quiet. Röhm had no idea what awaited him. Bursting through the doors, Hitler entered Röhm's room. The man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him during the failed 1923 coup now stood in his nightshirt, confused, betrayed, and speechless. He was arrested on the spot. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, Germany descended into an unofficial, unannounced, but ruthlessly organized wave of political assassinations. There were no trials, no warrants, just lists of names, typed in secret, approved by Hitler, executed without mercy. The SA leadership was decapitated. Those loyal to Röhm were rounded up and either shot immediately or sent to secret detention sites. But the purge didn't stop there. Hitler used the chaos to settle scores. Anyone who had questioned his authority or could question it in the future became a target. Gresham of the von Schleicher, a former Chancellor, was murdered in his own home. Gregor Strasser, once a powerful figure in the Nazi Party, was gunned down without a word. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who had betrayed Hitler during the beer hall putsch, was hacked to death with axes. In total, over 85 people were confirmed killed, but the real number may have been much higher. Thousands more were arrested, interrogated, and made to disappear into the machinery of fear. The SS, under Himmler and Heydrich, emerged from the shadows as the new fist of the Nazi regime. Efficient, obedient, and utterly loyal to Hitler, they carried out the purge with chilling precision. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring ensured the police and air force fell in line, eager to prove his loyalty and outmaneuver his rivals. Each man competed for Hitler's favor, and that favor was measured in blood. When it was over, Hitler addressed the German nation. His voice, usually theatrical and passionate, was now cold, resolute. He declared that he alone was the supreme judge of the German people. He claimed that his actions, though harsh, had saved the nation from chaos, from a civil war plotted by traitors within. And the people remained silent. Some believed him. Others were terrified to speak. For many, it was a signal. No one was safe. From this point forward, opposition would not just be crushed, it would be erased. The Night of the Long Knives was not merely a purge, it was a transformation. From dictatorship cloaked in legality to a regime of absolute personal power. Hitler no longer shared rule with anyone. He had killed the last of his rivals, and in doing so, had sent a message to the world. I decide who lives. I decide who dies.
These are the names we must target.
A dictatorship is not built overnight. It grows in the silence of those who choose not to speak. The bloodshed had stopped. The bodies buried, the names scratched off lists. But in the days and weeks that followed the Night of the Long Knives, something more profound began to take root. Not just in the Nazi regime, but in the soul of the German nation. The first to respond were the Reichswehr generals. These were the men who, just weeks earlier, had threatened Hitler with military intervention unless Röhm and the SA were removed. Now their demands had been met and exceeded. On August 2nd, 1934, when President Hindenburg finally died, Hitler moved swiftly to merge the offices of Chancellor and President, proclaiming himself Führer, Supreme Leader of Germany. And in a moment that changed history, the German army swore an oath of personal loyalty not to the state, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. This oath was not a formality, it was a surrender. The last institution capable of opposing Hitler had now become his instrument. Meanwhile, the SA was shattered. Once 4 million strong, its leaders were dead, its members humiliated, absorbed, or cast aside. In its place rose a new power, darker, quieter, and far more dangerous: the SS. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS quickly evolved from a protective unit into a full-fledged terror apparatus. They now controlled the secret police, the concentration camps, and the ever-growing surveillance network that would soon suffocate all dissent. But perhaps the most lasting change was not in the army, nor in the SS. It was in the people. Across Germany, citizens, many of whom had cheered Hitler's rise, now looked upon their leader with a new emotion: fear. They heard the rumors, they read the censored papers, they saw who had disappeared, and they made a decision: not to speak, not to ask questions, not to resist. A chilling phrase began to define daily life: better to say nothing. He must have done something wrong. That's politics, not my business. Silence became survival, and survival became complicity. The international response? Muted. Some Western diplomats were shocked, but most chose strategic silence. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Mark Twain. The Night of the Long Knives was not just a historical event, it was a template, a blueprint for dictators, past, present, and future, on how to eliminate dissent, consolidate power, and use fear as a political weapon. What Hitler accomplished in 72 hours would echo for decades. Stalin in the Soviet Union learned the lesson well. So did Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and a long list of leaders who understood. When you remove the brakes, when no institution, no voice, no law stands in your way, power becomes godlike. But it comes at a cost, not just in lives lost, but in the silence that follows. After the purge, the German people did not rise, they did not resist, they complied, they adapted, and soon many cooperated. What began as fear evolved into passive acceptance, then into willful blindness, and finally into participation. By the time Hitler launched World War II, by the time the first concentration camps were full, and by the time millions were marched to their deaths, the silence of 1934 had become a chorus of complicity. That is the dark legacy of the Night of the Long Knives. But this story is not locked in the past. Wherever power goes unchecked, wherever leaders eliminate rivals instead of listening to them, wherever people trade truth for comfort or justice for security, the lesson of 1934 returns. So we must ask, what would you do if you lived in Germany that year? Would you believe the news? Would you look away? Would you whisper in fear or speak up knowing the risk? These are not rhetorical questions. They are eternal questions, because the machinery of tyranny is not built overnight. It starts with a fear, a choice, a silence, and even today, in many parts of the world, the knives are still being sharpened.